Right, people are coming in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on your location. My name is Archon Fung, and I'm the Winthrop, Laflin, McCormack Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I want to start with a few announcements on the behalf of the Ash Center. The center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Today's event is being recorded, and this video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel shortly after we conclude. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of this event. Please send them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via chat, and that'll make it a lot easier for us to process the questions and try to get to as many as we can. Now I'd like to briefly introduce my two good friends and colleagues who are joining me in the conversation today. Alex Keyssar is the Matthew W. Sterling Professor of History and Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an historian by training and long practice. He's specialized in the exploration of historical problems that have contemporary policy implications. His fantastic book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, was named the best book in U.S. history by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the LA Times Book Award. Alex's latest book, entitled Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, is published by Harvard University Press and arrived only last year and can't have come at a more timely moment. Last spring, he designed and taught a new course on the meaning, the history, and the consequences of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Guy Uriel-Charles is the Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. He teaches and writes about election law, race and law, constitutional law, and civil procedure. He's the founding director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics, and we were fortunate enough to pull him away from Duke University and bring him to the Harvard Law School, where we get to work with him, which is fantastic. He's currently working on a book on voting rights and the Voting Rights Act entitled The American Promise, Rethinking Voting Rights Law and Policy for a Divided America. Finally, I'd like to take a few seconds to mention that tomorrow is Election Day in the US. If you are eligible to vote and have not already done so, I'd encourage you to make a plan to vote tonight so you can vote tomorrow. We'll share a link to the Harvard Votes Challenge page, which has resources on how to find your voting location and learn what's going on your ballot and more. For Friends of the Ash Center Democracy Program, you will know that we have a special focus on participatory democracy, and question 1 on ballots on Boston's ballot tomorrow, if it's approved, would establish an Office of Participatory Budgeting, which is very unusual in American cities. So the aim of today's session is a deep dive into the prospects for the future of American democracy. Today, we'll focus on a major set of Senate reports that was released about 3 weeks ago. As part of the congressional effort to create an official, accurate account of the aftermath of the 2020 election, which, as we know, culminated in the riots on January 6th, the Senate Judiciary Committee has placed a special focus on President Trump's alleged efforts to improperly use the Department of Justice to subvert the outcomes of the 2020 election in late December 2020 and early January 2021. Critics of the president think that this episode brought America to the very edge of a constitutional crisis, unlike any since Watergate 50 years ago. The president's allies, on the other hand, characterize these very same events as a story about a president reasonably concerned about election integrity, and, as the Wall Street Journal put it, mostly honorable advisors and resilient institutions. In a somewhat unusual turn of events, the Judiciary Committee did not issue a single report, but rather there is a Democratic majority staff report and a Republican staff minority report that addresses the same set of events, but comes to these very different conclusions. So I'm going to ask Alex and Guy a few questions here for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience question and answer and discussion. So please, as you think about these remarks and this topic, please enter your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so the first issue is what happened. Let's talk about what the events that these two reports cover. They're talking today about a complicated set of events. By comparisons, Nixon's Watergate crisis seemed easier to understand. There was an illegal break-in into Democratic Party headquarters. Republican finance and directed operatives broke in. And the big question, as Senator Howard Baker at the time put it, what did President Nixon know and when did he know it? In this Trump DOJ debacle, there is no such bombshell activity that everyone agrees was wrong. That's why there are separate reports. To begin, help us understand whether these big reports amount to any kind of big deal that should concern us. What worries you most about what happened here between Trump, his advisors, and the Department of Justice? So let me kick it to Alex first.
Well, I think that what worries me most about these events, and again, we should realize the Judiciary Committee report is really focusing on events that ended just before January 6th. I mean, the report, I'm very concerned, and we all are very concerned about what happened on January 6th and other things that involved the planning of it and then the aftermath of it. But the Judiciary Committee report is focused on events, particularly in the 3 or 4 weeks before January 4th. And what you see in the report, and that's not denied anywhere in the minority report, is a series of approaches to Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and to other people in the Justice Department, asking him to intervene in a number of different ways in order to affect the counting of electoral votes, in order to affect the electoral votes that were cast. And by and large, the overall pattern is the assertion from the president himself and this is interesting, and from many of his chief staffers who seem to be altogether on board. Mark Meadows his chief of staff seems to be very much on board. The pattern seems to be that they repeat allegations about fraud in particular states that had been out there and known for quite a while. And most of them had already been adjudicated in the courts and declared to be not of interest. I mean, there were a few new ones that came in, such as the allegation that from somebody in Italy who worked for a U.S. aerospace company, that the Italian military had contrived somehow to use the internet to change votes. I mean, that had not been dealt with in the courts. But by and large, these were allegations that had already been rejected, but that are being brought up again and again and again in order to press the Justice Department to investigate further and then possibly to intervene with 7 states in order to, in effect, in order to get the states, we can talk about the details of this later. This was the Jeffrey Clark strategy, but in order to get those states to reject their already certified electoral votes and have their state legislatures instead choose electors. So it's a succession of events, and then I'll just make a final comment, turn this over to Guy. Then the minority report basically says, well, none of these things actually happened. I mean, the approaches happened, but Jeffrey Rosen and Richard Donahue in the Justice Department didn't do what Trump wanted. And so what's the big deal? I mean, it's a little bit, when you read the 2 reports back to back, it's a little bit like, the minority report reads a little bit like, okay, yes, they assembled the gun, they put it all out there, they arranged everything, but the gun didn't go off, so no harm, no foul.
Guy, over to you. What do you think? What concerns you, if anything?
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm very concerned. So, just following up on what Alex said. So, one way to think about this is an attempt to capture whatever parts of the government that can be captured to undermine the results of the 2020 election. And if we're focusing on the Department of Justice, right, but it was a fairly broad attempt. It was an attempt to capture the courts where possible. It was an attempt to see what can be done with military officials. This was an attempt to pressure state legislators. It was an attempt to pressure election officials. And the particular focus here is on the Department of Justice, which is supposed to be the nation's top governmental law enforcement officials. They're not supposed to be at all involved in declaring who wins or doesn't win an election. They have a role to play in election integrity matters. That is, if federal law has been violated and someone tried to subvert an election, engage in vote fraud, then the Department of Justice has a role to play in and after the fact and figuring out what happened and then to bring those individuals to account. But they certainly are not an organ and an arm of a campaign of the president and then attempt to subvert the results of the election. So this is a widespread attempt here focused on the DOJ to try to get the federal officials involved in undermining the results of an election. And what is deeply concerning is the fact that there were individuals who were willing. So Alex mentioned the chief of staff. He also, and there were some individuals in the DOJ itself, right, who were willing to entertain these ideas and push some extremely ridiculous, not just legal theories, but factual theories. And if it weren't for some very courageous set of individuals within the DOJ, then who knows where we would have been. So to get some, the acting assistant attorney general, to get somebody to say, hey, we're pursuing an investigation, to try to get the state legislatures to send in extra electors, right? So if it weren't for some individuals who said that these were baseless and that this was an improper use of the DOJ, that there aren't supposed to be these types of communications. If it weren't for these individuals, who knows where we would have been? So the reason why I'm concerned is because in many ways, democratic crisis avoiding a democratic crisis depends upon the willingness and strength of character of particular individuals to follow the law and their conscience, as opposed to conceding to the pressures, the significant pressures that were being imposed from and by the White House.
Archon, if I can add one more thing in here, is back because we know this, but not everyone. Part of what's notable about the main events discussed in the report, and that Guy and I are referring to, is that these all occurred after Trump's attorney general, William Barr, had submitted his resignation and made the public statement that there was no fraud that warranted any consideration by the federal government.
Yeah, good. I have two.
And one more, just one more point on that point, which is in violation really of DOJ policy, right? Barr conducted some minimal investigation as a way of dealing with the pressure from the White House, and then issued his statement. And nonetheless, there continued to be significant pressure.
That's good. I have a kind of technical question that may help people in the audience that may be unclear, right? So, Guy, I think your understanding and what I understood from reading these parts of the report is, if the DOJ thinks that there's some election malfeasance really going on, let's just stipulate that there is, hypothetically, right? Like, it might be hard for someone in the audience to square 2 points that you made. One, it's their job to investigate that malfeasance. And number two, they shouldn't influence the outcome of an election, right? You might think, okay, well, if they investigate and find malfeasance, they have to change the votes. That's going to change the outcome of the election. So what is your understanding about how DOJ is supposed to square that circle of both investigating and being responsible for election integrity, but not altering the outcome of that election?
Yes, thank you. So my understanding is that what the DOJ is supposed to do is wait until the election process is over, or it can conduct some preliminary investigation, but not in any overt way, if it believes that there is some, right, this is taking into account the concession that if it believes that there's some election malfeasance, and then to deal with the potential crime that has occurred, and to assure them that people are brought to justice. What is being asked to do here, what they were being asked to do here is twofold. Well, threefold, really. One, they were being asked to investigate or address false allegations. Two, they were being asked to send a message that they were investigating, and something that they is against their policy. So if there were legitimate and credible allegations, they would investigate very subtly in a way that wouldn't influence the certification or any part of the process, certainly not pre-election, and wait until after the certification process and everything has been done. So they were asked to use the process of investigation as litigation strategy as well as propaganda, right? So they were being asked to do that as well. And then, of course, they were also being asked to bring political investigation. So, one of the policies that the DOJ has always lived by, like they investigate cases, not people, but they were asked to bring a political investigation as opposed to one based strictly on the merits. So they square the circle by waiting until the electoral process is over and then being much more forthright where they need to be, or much more transparent about the nature of their investigation. But they certainly try not to do so in a way that would interfere with whatever electoral processes that are taking place.
Oh, that's very helpful. And then just to point people, I think to me, the most dramatic moment in, it's a Senate report, right? So it's not a novel, but it does have some dramatic moments. And to me, the most dramatic moment is the moment that Alex and Guy are referring to, in which Rob Rosen and Donahue have organized themselves and other senior lawyers in the Department of Justice to resign if the president and his staff really insist upon this point. And that's quite a dramatic moment, and kind of echoes the Saturday Night Massacre. But we'll talk about that in a moment, or as things go on. The second issue that I wanted to raise is a little bit outside the four walls of the Senate report, but occurs contemporaneously, or at least it was revealed to us. It both occurred contemporaneously and was revealed to us when the Senate reports were being released. And that is this memo by John Eastman, who was an advisor to President Trump. And he sent a memo that you can download on CNN if you want, to Vice President Trump, laying out some advice about what what Vice President Trump should do during the Electoral Count Act. And here's an image of the memo. I just pulled out some pieces of it, right? And so Alex will go into the Electoral Count Act in a moment, but it requires the vice president to kind of go through each state and read out the electors that it has certified. And so Eastman recommends that when Trump gets to Arizona, he announces that he has multiple slates of electors, and so is going to defer the decision. That is the decision about who Arizona has supported for president of the United States in the 2020 election. And then Eastman advised, at the end, he announces that because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, and these are the 7 states that Alex mentioned in his opening remarks, that there are no electors that can be deemed to be validly appointed in those 7 states. And therefore, pursuant to the 12th Amendment, no candidate has achieved a necessary majority of Electoral College votes. When that happens, it sends the matter to the House, where each state gets one vote. The Republicans currently at that point control 26 of the state delegations. The bare majority needed to win that vote. And then in that circumstance, Donald Trump would be reelected president for another 4 years. So that is the kind of contents of the Eastman memo there. Alex, do you want to say a little bit about how this fits in both to the Senate report and the Electoral Count Act?
Well, the way it fits, it relates to the Senate report, although it's never mentioned in the Senate report. But what the Eastman memo, and we know that the Eastman memo had the attention of the White House and the president, and they were actually pressing it. And there were a lot of other variants. I mean, that was one scenario. Eastman had about 5 or 6 different scenarios, and that they were simultaneously pushing forward this strategy, the core of which would be to have Pence make declarations such that one of two things would happen: that either the election would go to the House instead of being decided by electoral votes, or that there would be some confusion declared and the electoral votes from some states declared not to be legitimate, and then you would turn that back over to the state legislatures. Now, the connection of this to the Electoral Count Act, and which is, a year and a half ago, there were like 11 people in the United States who had ever heard of the Electoral Count Act. Now there's some hundreds, but still it's obscure. It's a piece of legislation that was passed in 1887, coming out of, but not, and this is the point I want to make, it's not just about, it was coming out of the electoral crisis of the 1876 election, which was the famous crisis where it seemed to deadlock. It went to Congress. There were 39 disputed electoral votes, et cetera, et cetera. But here, I guess I want to step back further before 1876 to try to give an understanding of what the problem is, or was, that the Electoral Count Act was designed to solve. The problem in the first instance is the Constitution says very little about the process through which state electoral votes are assembled and conveyed. It says they shall be open, they shall be counted in the presence of the President of the Senate. That's it. Okay. It's very unclear. A serious problem with how to deal with this. There were antecedent rules in the Congress, but I want to sketch out this problem. In the early years of Reconstruction, there were states from the South that had, as required by the Union government, by the federal government, they had approved the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendments and said that allowing African Americans to vote, and incorporated them into their state constitutions. And that was a way of offering a guarantee to the federal government that they would adhere to these principles. But that guarantee wasn't always followed so quickly. So as early as the early 1870s, there were southern states that were not permitting African Americans to vote. And then when they came forward with their electoral votes, the question that confronted Congress, and it was Republicans in Congress at this point, was, do we accept these electoral votes from states which we know have wholesale suppressed the votes of African Americans? Do we really want to say these are valid electoral votes? Do we just want to say whatever a state reports is going to be fine? And the answer to that was obviously no, right? You can't just say whatever a state reports, even if it's discriminating, even if it's doing whatever, Congress is going to accept those votes. So then the question became, what's the procedure through which Congress gets to judge and gauge the validity of electoral votes reported by the states? It took, there's a crisis around that. In 1876, they appointed a completely separate commission mostly outside of Congress and probably unconstitutional to resolve the 1876 crisis. But it took them another 11 years to come up with a procedural suggestion about what to do. And what the Electoral Count Act does, in effect, is to say that the electoral votes reported by a state can be rejected by Congress only if both branches of Congress vote to reject it. But there's another set of circumstances that can arise, which is that two sets of electors are presented to Congress from different wings, say, of a state government. I mean, Georgia, the official, and then the Georgia legislature. And in any dispute, the chambers of Congress are supposed to convene separately and discuss whether they accept the objection or not. And the rule there is that, again, objections will be respected only if both houses concur. If there is a split between two houses about two different sets of electors, then the victory goes to whichever set of electors is certified by the executive, the chief executive of the state, the governor of the state. That was a little bit of an ace in the hole that the Democrats had this last time around, because in some of these states, even though the legislatures were Republican, the governors were Democrats. But the broad point here that I would make, and this relates to questions we can talk about later if we get to later about what is to be done, is that it is a very murky, clumsy process filled with ambiguities. There are at least some law professors that I've read, and Guy, I would defer to Guy on this, who think that the whole Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional or that parts of it are unconstitutional. But this is an extremely muddy and dispute-inviting process for very important elections.
Thank you very much for that. And there's people in the audience, everybody on the panel is deeply concerned with the fragility of American democracy. And one reason to have this deep dive here is that fragility really depends on a huge amount of institutional detail and the fights that people were having in late 2020, early 2021, that they may well have again. And so I want to ask each of you just to offer one version, right, of playing these scenarios out a little bit, the bad ones. So when Senator Durbin claims when he was rolling out the report that the report shows the American people just how close we came to a constitutional crisis, do you think he was right? And he is right. And in particular, what different decisions and actions would have provoked the crisis? And for you, maybe offer just one version each of what you think a constitutional crisis might have looked like if just a couple of things have happened differently in late 2020, early 2021, if you think a constitutional crisis was a possibility.
Well, a constitutional crisis definitely is a possibility. And it goes to the point that Alex was making and that you're drawing up on, which is it's like living in a house that was built 300 years ago, and you're now having to face up with the fact that there's something deeply fundamentally wrong with the plumbing, there is something deeply fundamentally wrong with the electricity, and a major storm is coming. And the question simply is, at what point in time will the perfect sets of situation arise in which you start getting significant flooding and significant problems with the foundations of that old rickety house, right? So we have procedures in place that are not responsive to the 21st century way in which we conduct American democracy. There is no central mechanism in which we can say, oh, let's certify the federal presidential election at a centralized level. We depend upon the states to do it. they use different sets of mechanisms to do it. It is sometimes inflected by partisanship. So what happens then if you get a series of state legislators and the electoral count in their state goes the wrong way, but they decide that they're going to send in a different set of electors, right? A different slate of electors. That can present us with a significant constitutional crisis. We see in this report from the Senate Judiciary Committee that the Democrats look at the issue one way, the Republicans look at the issue the other way. We see post-January 6th how many Republican legislators were still willing to fight the certification process, notwithstanding what happened, right? Some of their lives were at risk. Right? And so we are dependent upon the goodwill of individuals who may not always be acting in good faith where the partisan circumstances call for. And that's what could set up in a constitutional crisis if our partisan divisions get the better of us and people decide that it's not about what's best for the country, but it's about how can I hold on to power as much as possible, that my party can hold on to power as much as possible, because our circumstances, the rules that we have for dealing with presidential elections they're just significantly outmoded and outdated.
Alex, do you have a particular scenario in mind? What would it look like? Some people, I don't know whether this is a cause for comfort or a worry. So in the comments, some people were saying, well, you know, if the nightmare scenario had happened, people would be out on the streets. So I don't know what the next sentence is. Oh, then that would be self-correcting, or then it would be civil war. I'm not sure, but Alex, what do you think?
Well, you know, I mean, look, there's certainly a scenario in which Vice President Pence cooperated with people who were challenging and objecting to the electoral votes of those seven states, and sent them into deliberations. I mean, that again, that depended on one person. That depended on Vice President Pence and his staff, and then as some sign, I don't quite know how to take this, but that he sought guidance from former Vice President Dan Quayle, who I would not have thought of as a primary theorist of the Constitution, but that would have been, you know, an extraordinary crisis, had that scenario in any one of its forms, and I think that a step that, I mean, whether crisis means people are in the streets, it would have meant that, certainly. But I think there's another, the likelihood is, as was true in 2000, the likelihood is that one way or another, it would have ended up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would have had to say something about it, because there was no other group. Actually, I was at a lunch with Justice Scalia after the 2000 election debacle. He and I didn't agree about much, but he said, we had to take the case. There was nobody else who could decide this. But as happened in that election, it would have been magnified by 100 in this case. You would have had an important presidential election in which, by the way, one candidate won 7 million more votes than the other candidate, right? You have to do democratic legitimacy, but you would have had the election decided by detailed interpretations of arcane details of the law. Now you can get a resolution that way, but that's really no way to run a railroad. And that's what would have happened in this case. There would have had to been sort of, detailed interpretations of the Electoral Count Act and everything that it implied in the few cases that have arisen since then.
Right. And you can get a resolution, but you might not get a broadly legitimate decision.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, good. So on to the second report, just for a few minutes on the Republican response. We already mentioned this one was led by ranking member Charles Grassley, ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Republican side. I think it's fair to say my reading of the report is that it views the Democratic version as alarmist and unjustified accusations against the president. In particular, they stressed that none of the things that the majority report was worried about came to pass. No letter from the DOJ to the states to press electoral investigations, no firing of Attorney General Rosen or acting Deputy AG Donahue, no mass resignations from the Justice Department. Furthermore, the Republican report says that President Trump's actions don't even rise to the level of impropriety because his concerns about the electoral system were not unreasonable. All he was asking for was another look. What do you think of the defense? Nothing happened, nothing to see here. Suppose the president did have concerns that you regarded as justified about the integrity of the election. In that case, how would what Trump did be wrong? What actions would be wrong specifically? Maybe Guy and then Alex. Yeah.
Sure. So here's the process that we have, right? If the president believed that something is amiss in Georgia, then there is a process both to contest the electoral results in Georgia, as well as a process by which Georgia can vindicate the violation of its laws. So it's one thing to say, I'm going to pursue litigation, which they did and lost almost every single one of them because some of the claims were just plain, right? I mean, like the claim that the CIA was colluding with the Italian, like, I was just like, when you read some of these things that were taken serious, so it's one thing to say people voted illegally. It's another thing to say that the CIA was colluding with the Italians and then change Trump votes into Biden votes. Right? So you're asking the Department of Justice to go and investigate purely outrageous claims that they have absolutely no business being involved in, right? That's the problem, to politicize the Department of Justice and to use them as an arm of a presidential campaign, right? So if the president has worries about illegal votes in particular states, or that the processes of particular states weren't followed, then certainly litigation can be filed in those states, which they were. Certainly the state officials can investigate illegal votes, which they did. And possibly at a later time, if federal law was violated, the DOJ can follow its own set of procedures, which it has a set of procedures to follow to assure that if federal law has been violated, that to bring the perpetrators to justice. That's not what was happening here. What was happening is an attempt to use the DOJ as an arm of the campaign, and that is fundamentally problematic.
Yeah. Just a couple of glosses on that. One, in terms of that kind of procedure, the fact is that an investigatory procedure had been set underway in Georgia, for example, where they got the U.S. Attorney for Northern Georgia, B.J. Pack, and B.J. Pack started, looking at things and then, decided there was nothing there, and they put such pressure on him, the White House, directly. That he ended up simply resigning as U.S. Attorney to avoid that. But to go back to, I think the more central points, the minority. If you read the minority report, and it talks about the president and the president acting in the interest of, it was reasonable. These were reasonable. He had concerns about the election, and that was reasonable and part of his office. The report never acknowledges that he was a candidate, that the president was a candidate in the election, and that that he was a participant and that he was a partisan. And it tries to denature the whole conflict by pretending that that was the case. And what worries me in terms of the future is that by writing such a report, making such claims, it seems to me that the minority in the Judiciary Committee was sanctioning a repetition of those kinds of actions in the future. And that's troublesome.
Yeah, very good, very good. So now, last couple of topics before kind of going to some of the question and answer and discussion from the audience and everybody who's participating out there on this Zoom webinar. Kind of by way of assessment, how big a deal do we have? Is this? So we have a better sense now of what happened between the Trump administration and his advisors in the DOJ. It's a very complicated and nuanced set of turns of events that relies on some understanding of the independence of DOJ from the White House, a lot of understanding about what kinds of investigations are appropriate when, what it means to politicize versus just investigate something. How big a deal in these critical weeks before January 6th do you think this was? And in particular, how does it measure up to other moments in our history when democracy has been under stress? How close is it to moments when other countries have experienced what some people are calling democratic backsliding? Guy, what do you think?
Sure. Look, I think this was a big deal. Anytime you see a group of people decide to take matters into their own hands and to storm a governmental building as a way of preventing a legitimate and peaceful transfer of power, it is a big deal. And all the things that led to it are absolutely significant. We live in a moment that is in which we're very deeply polarized, that we don't agree on much as a country. We don't see the same set of facts the same way, not even the elites among us. So like from, right, all across the class spectrum, we don't watch the same things. We seem to have very little in common, and our partisan divisions are extremely strong, and we don't have electoral procedures that that are designed to address these types of divisions. I think this was a very big deal because this is a point that Alex made that I would like to emphasize. There was no difference between a campaign and the office of the president. And there was an attempt to use the full power of the federal government at all levels in order to maintain political power or to subvert an election. Now, it didn't come to pass for a lot of reasons, some of which were, like when you read about Mike Pence, sort of almost vacillating and waiting for somebody like Dan Quayle to say something, right? It didn't come to pass. What I found just alarming reading the accounts afterwards was really how close we came to the reliance on one individual, right? Rosen was going to resign. But other people were willing to do the president's bidding. So I think this is a set of potential crises, but also alarming set of events in and of themselves, and that we ought to be concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to that, assuming that you're about to ask me, Archon, I mean, I also think it's a very big deal. I mean, I think that this makes Watergate, frankly, look very bland. I mean, Watergate was a kind of illegal political dirty trick. What it was about was to get an advantage in a campaign. Okay, I mean, it was illegal. They were breaking into it was a crime, but it was to get an advantage in a campaign. This was about overturning the results of an election. And that strikes me as a different kettle of fish. And, it's interesting. You alluded earlier to the course that I taught last spring, and I'll be teaching an updated version of it this spring. It was called Understanding What Happened on January 6th. And as we started that course and as we talked about it, there was substantial lack of clarity in my mind and everyone in the classes about exactly what had happened and why. We had an interesting discussion early on about what to call it. Should we call it a riot, a protest, a coup d'etat, an insurrection? We didn't know what terms were appropriate because we couldn't tell what had happened. Well, we've learned a lot. We haven't learned everything, in the last 10, 11 months, but we've learned a lot. And it increasingly looks like a premeditated, multi-pronged, if badly conceived and badly executed, attempt to keep in power a government that had not been reelected by the people. That's a big deal.
And Archon, can I just add one other point, which is that some of these allegations were purely outrageous, right? But imagine a world in which there were some quasi-legitimate disputes, right? In which now then people may feel justified to subvert processes and the rule of law because there may have been some potential irregularities in one parts or another, right? So we're talking about a context in which the reality showed that this was actually, quite frankly, an extremely well-run election, and that the allegations of malfeasance were simply fantastical and truly unbelievable. But change that scenario, and now think about what the circumstances look like, and that should be enough to keep us awake at night.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of points there. Alex's point that in his view, this is much more significant than Watergate because of what the object of the alleged malfeasance was. One was a Watergate, that one was an effort to gain advantage in a campaign, whereas if the Democratic report here, the allegation is it's an effort to overturn an election. Those are very, very different objectives that we should evaluate at very different scales. And then I also wanted to just highlight Guy's point, a version of it, elaborate on it, is that in some ways 2020 expands the repertoire of political contestation to now include all of these tools about questioning how to question, exactly procedurally how to question at many, many points the outcomes of these elections, and those may come back to haunt American democracy in various ways going into the future. And that leads us into this topic that has been brought up in the audience Q&A in different ways many times already. So what can be done now that we understand both the significance and the gravity of the issue and in some of its details? What can we do to prevent future presidents from using the Department of Justice, a central rule of law federal institution, from being used to undermine democracy, right? So my majority report has a bunch of policy measures, create more barriers between the DOJ and the White House, reduce the ability of DOJ to affect election outcomes. Guy and Alex have both really stressed how at many points the report reveals how it came down to the decisions of particular individuals with holding small d democratic norms. Vice President Pence on one hand, Rob Rosen, McDonough, others, right? And so that's a normative and ethical commitment that we can't rely on all the way down. I mean, a political official just might fire the ethical people till he gets to one who's a little bit less ethical, right? So
that was Robert Bork,
and that was Robert Bork, right? And the Saturday Night Massacre, that's right. And so what do we do here? Do we rely on policy, the integrity of public officials? Will these be enough? Some other category of measure? Alex, what do you think we should do?
Well, I think, look, I think there's different levels of it. I mean, I think that what the Judiciary Committee report and recommending different rules governing the relationships between the executive branch and or not the executive branch, between the White House and the DOJ. That seems to me to make perfect sense. Guy would know much better than I, but that would seem to me to make a whole lot of sense. As mentioned earlier, I think that revising the Electoral Count Act of 1887 or writing entirely new legislation that would clarify the process would surely be a big help. And I think that Guy's suggestion of having a nationally standardized process of certification for electoral votes. And we have a national election that's a weird smorgasbord of state elections, and that's creating problems. But all of that said, and I think we should do all of that, and I think we should get rid of the Electoral College to make, to simplify things even further. But all of that said, it will, and there's no foolproof system. And in any system that that we concoct, there's going to be moments, there are going to be particular decision junctures where it's going to depend on the integrity and honesty of people, and we have to do our best to make sure that people get into those positions. There's a very interesting piece that was written sometime 6 months ago, and I forget by whom, but it looked at the half dozen or dozen most important places where somebody had stood their ground. One of the most famous of whom was like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who said no, he would not come up with an extra 7,900 votes for President Trump, but pointed out that all of those places where the guardrails held, in effect, were by individuals rather than by legislatures. So there's something about having, and notably, a number of the reforms in Republican states have now moved to replace those individuals with power in legislatures where groupthink can prevail and where individuals don't feel responsible. But I think that, keeping it in the hands of individuals and having all of us take very seriously, when your candidates running for Secretary of State, don't yawn, actually pay attention to who they are, and is this somebody who will preserve the integrity of our elections? That's where I come out.
Thank you. Guy, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alex, and even, I see in the chat, even if you get rid of the Electoral College, which I think we should, but have the decentralized way in which we conduct American elections will still come under some pressure, right? And so I think we would have to think about that as well. I mean, I think the one thing that is also worth thinking through, one question that we haven't fully resolved is, to what extent are some of the issues that we're seeing a function of a cult of personality overlaid upon so much else that we have in American democratic politics, right? And if it is a cult of personality, so if it's sort of like Trumpian and Trumpian-like, whether it's a different Trump on the right or a different type of Trump on the left, right? So to what extent would these be driven by a cult of personality? Then one ought to think about, well, can you strengthen institutions? So is it possible, we do live in a world of strong partisanship, but weak parties. So might it make better sense to strengthen the role of the parties in the presidential nominating processes, to take the process out of the hands of campaigns, for example, and put them in the hands of parties that may or may that can be punished for different sets of behaviors, right? But trying to experiment and think about, because that's something that wouldn't require, getting rid of the Electoral College. Okay, that's a significant undertaking, but thinking about how we might do our presidential nomination processes, that's something that can be done outside of the constitutional and national systems, and might enable us to deal with avoid some of these types of crises.
All right, let me just underscore some, point to a suggestion in the chat, and this has come up implicitly, which is the idea that there should be some kind of management body analogous to Elections Canada to have a kind of national civil service that deals with elections. Yes, there should be, and that could be important. And it's not just Canada. India has an extraordinary one, which manages to pull off elections in a country with many more people than we have.
Yeah, and this goes to Guy's 300-year-old house point. I mean, our house was built when the state was quite small, and people probably didn't conceive of independent electoral administrative agencies because there were no agencies. Right. Good. So, just to highlight in the chat, many comments about the Electoral College and getting rid of the Electoral College. I think among the panelists, Alex and Guy, there's agreement that would be a good thing. Let me just commend Alex's really definitive history of the Electoral College. Why do we still have the Electoral College? Again, it came out last year. Everybody should run out and get that book. I don't have mine here because it's on my bedside where I keep it always. It's not in my office. So check that book out. And then there was an interesting first question in the chat. I guess interesting to me at least. To what extent, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, to what extent do the actions of Trump and his advisors, how should we see that in the context of creeping enlargement of executive authority, which I guess is kind of two spins on that. One, I think there has been enlargement of executive authority over several decades, but I guess I usually think of that as executive authority doing things that the executive wants to do rather than mucking around with elections. And I'm just asking whether you guys think about it the same way. But now that there's a precedent of using electoral authority in that way, or executive authority in that way, is it going to be hard to put it back in the box, whether it's a Democratic or Republican executive? Now that we have a strong precedent, it seems like, of using executive power to tilt your electoral outcomes in your direction, are we going to be able to put that back in a box? Or is it, as Guy suggested, maybe the problem of one person rather than more broad?
I view there's definitely a link, right? So like we've got this strong cult of personality populism question, which the executive can easily take advantage of. And so I think the question of executive authority when a person is in office and exercising power, I think it's an important one. But I think that's different from the use of the office as a way of subverting and undermining elections, right? I mean, I think the link is the strong cult of personality and the response to a faux type of populism. But I think the exercise raised two different sets of worries.
And there's a lot of questions. Maybe this should be the last kind of topic before we wrap up. There's a lot of questions in the chat about outside of policymaking, what academic institutions, what citizens, what commentators can do to sanction individuals and policy actors and other people who violate democratic norms and procedures in this way. Do we have any capability to punish? Can we generate more capability to punish? What do you think? Alex?
You want to revive having the stocks on the Cambridge Common or something, put people,
yes,
put people in the stocks. That somehow seems to be the spirit of it. I think that, I would be, I get a little bit wary about punishing, but there should be sanctions. And I think that one of the most disturbing things about what seems like it will be the long-term aftermath of what happened last year is that the people who were at the top are going to experience almost no sanctions. I mean, it's the people who broke into Congress, people getting arrested, they're getting fines, et cetera. And it looks like there might be a few lawyers who get disbarred. And Rudy Giuliani's practice is probably a danger in the future for all sorts of reasons. But on the whole, I think that, well, to me, perhaps the most disturbing feature of the whole episode, although, I'd have to I have to parse that closely to say it was the most disturbing episode, is the fact that, for the first 2 or 3 weeks after the events of January 6th, there was a significant amount of Republican denunciation of it. I mean, starting back, say, with Lindsey Graham that evening on the floor, saying this has gone too far. This is, we can't do this. They were drawing lines in the sand, and then somehow within a couple of months, those lines in the sand were completely erased, and fictions have been created about what actually happened and didn't happen, and the Senate Minority Report is contributing to those fictions, and that does not bode well for any settlements other than decisive political settlements, and I'm not sure those are in the offing.
Guy, what do you think? And any last thoughts?
Yeah,
before
just
we wrap up?
one last thought. It's too bad it's the last ones. I would be curious to hear what the both of you thought about this. I was actually thought that the majority report, notwithstanding some of the revelations, really did not set the baseline framework for a significant set of broad sanctions. Right, and that is, it's not a basis for saying, okay, here are the people that we need to bring to criminal account. It is, there are definitely some bad actors and villains, and the actions described were extremely disturbing at broad levels, but and then some people like Cleta Mitchell, for example, one of the lawyers involved, had to leave her firm, right? So there were some sanctions, and you could impose some social sanctions, but beyond that, of some named individuals, some specific individuals that we've named, I was surprised that we didn't see a broader frame for greater opprobrium, at whether it's legal or something quasi-legal.
I see. So a framework for thinking about politicizing the DOJ and the consequences that should follow from that if you're in the executive branch, if you're in the office of the White House.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it did not do that. I don't think it tried to do that. I mean, the policy measures were of a very different kind. Yeah. Alex, any concluding thoughts?
No, I mean, I would be continuing the themes that I was uttering there near the end. I mean, or going back to the title of this session, yes, I think that what happened on January 6th and in the 2 months leading up to that and the several weeks afterward do constitute a major threat to American democracy. I think that was true then. I think it remains just as true. And I think there's questions. I mean, Guy's last question, and many others that came up, and looking at what's in the chat, and I haven't even seen most of the Q&A. There are a lot of questions for all of us to wrestle with and not be passive about. There's work to be done.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Alex and Guy, and for all the many people who participated in this webinar. This was on a pretty narrow and technical set of topics, and I was somewhat surprised that so many people joined in, but delighted at the same time, because we really have to work hard to understand. I mean, I think most people joining the webinar have a pretty deep commitment to American democracy and its integrity and are worried about its fragility. And it's easy to just kind of take the headline positions, but what's going on is very complicated and nuanced. And if we are to have a hope that this recent past is not a solid prologue to the next chapter in American democracy, we really need to understand that quite deeply and be prepared and think about ways to make American democracy stronger. And so I'm just, every conversation with Alex and Guy is very illuminating for me personally. I'm just so deeply grateful to be able to join you in this investigation. And thank you very much.
Thank you for putting this together, Archon, and thanks. Good to